Okay, guys, I'm conscious that we have three speakers today, so we might get on with it. You're all incredibly welcome to our Biodiversity Week, our third webinar of the week this week. And my name is Rob Nelson. I'm a Green Schools officer under the Biodiversity team. Unfortunately, Claire, our coordinator, can't be here today, but it's for a very good reason. She's at one of our award ceremonies to give out a presentation for our two Biodiversity Schools of the Year. That's a new award that we're just doing this year, and we'll be doing it from now on. So, School Murrah Trim Secondary School has won the Secondary School of the Year, and Dunboyne National School has won the National School of the Year for Biodiversity. So, very exciting that we are able to give out those awards now, and that will be a thing going forward. So, you can keep that in mind while you're working on biodiversity. Okay, so we're here celebrating Ireland's Biodiversity Week all week. Webinars each morning at 11 o'clock from Monday to Thursday. And then on Friday, we have some draw-along videos that I've put together on some of the animals that we learned about. So the otter, the hedgehog, and the white-tailed eagle. So you can look at them at any point, and I'll share our link to that page in the chat after in a few minutes. So just to please keep your microphones on mute, and you can ask any questions you have in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. The session is being recorded, but only the speakers will be on the video. So you can keep your cameras on if you want. It's fine. It's just the presenters that will be on the video. And we'll share that on our YouTube channel afterwards for anyone who can't make it today. So today's session is all about invasive species. And we're going to start with my colleague, Aengus Kennedy from Green Schools Travel. And he's going to give a kind of a general overview about invasive species. And then we have my colleague from Liane Costello from Clean Coasts. She's our Marine Biodiversity Officer, a new position we have with Clean Coasts this year. And she's going to give a little bit of an overview of some of the species on our coasts. And then we have a very special guest from St. Joseph's Secondary School in Rush. We have a competition called the YRE or Young Reporters for Environment, and one of our winning articles this year was written by Marta Feely, who is going to talk to us about one of our invasive species called the New Zealand flatworm. And then again, at the end, we will have the opportunity for some questions. So keep that in mind, and you can pop them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them the whole time as well. So that is me. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to hand over to Aengus, and Aengus is going to share his slides, and he is going to give us a little bit more information about invasive species. So I'm going to stop my spotlight. I'm going to spotlight Aengus. Have I done that right? Yes.
Hopefully that's coming up
No,
now.
perfect. And yeah, any questions you have, you can pop in the chat. So over to you, Aengus.
Okay, great stuff. Can you see my presentation there, Rob? Can you?
I can only see you. I'll remove the pin. Switch to shared content. Okay, now I can see. Yeah, I you haven't clicked into the slideshow yet.
There we are. There we are. There we are.
Perfect.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks, folks. Thanks for your patience with that. And hello, everybody. Great. With people from all over the country, which is fantastic to see. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about what are invasive species. What's the idea? Well, sometimes they're called alien species, so invasive aliens. And are they really aliens? Have they come from outer space, or have they come from somewhere else on the planet, and what they're all about? That picture there is down the country of rhododendron, very beautiful rhododendron ponticum, it's called, and it's certainly an invasive species. It tends to share, or it tends to take over huge tracts of land if the soil is suitable and the area is suitable and the rest of it. Anyway, we'll go backwards a little bit though. First of all, before there was any invasive species, in fact, before there was even us coming to Ireland. So Ireland's natural habitats and the very first humans that would have encountered Ireland, they would have seen a lot of this kind of thing, because about 90% of Ireland was covered in woodland. 90% of Ireland covered woodland, which is kind of amazing to think, really. So much woodland. There was big raised bogs in the middle, and of course there was lakes and the rest of it. But woodland was dominant all the way from the north to the south, from the west to the east, different types of woodland. But that's what it was, our native woodland. And now, tragically, we have, I think it's about 11% of Ireland is covered in woodland, and less than 2 of that, less than 2% is native woods. And of course, native woods and native habitats in general, they support native animals and native plants. And the more native habitats we have, the better it is for the rest of our nature. In fact, an awful lot of our birds that you'll see in your school garden, the robin and the chaffinch and the blackbird, we call them garden birds now, but they're woodland birds, because once upon a time the whole place was woods, and they were living there. And some of those species have been able to survive and adapt to us changing our landscape. But humans, for thousands of years, have utterly changed our landscape to suit it for our own needs. So native species are species that people that found their own way here. People didn't bring in. Non-native species are species like beech trees, and so you can see the non-native beech woods in that slide. That people have brought in. So non-native species aren't from Ireland. People had to bring them in at some stage, and a huge amount of both plants and animals in Ireland are non-native. And people brought them in for their gardens. People brought them in like cows to farm them, sheep, dogs, cats. They're not native. We brought all of that stuff in. And that doesn't make them invasive. So the beech trees will sit there, lovely beech forests, and they don't hold as much diversity. Quite often non-native stuff doesn't support as much other life, but it doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing at all. Sycamore trees, horse chestnut trees are non-native trees, but they're a lovely thing to have. And they do help our biodiversity to a certain extent. So native and non-native, and it's good not to mix those up with invasives. Invasives are different again. They are, of course, non-native. They've been brought in by people, sometimes on purpose, sometimes accidentally. But there's something that takes over an area, it outcompetes. Because you got to remember, to understand biodiversity, understand the different living things, which is what biodiversity means, you've got to think about competition. Everything is in competition all the time. Every single plant is in competition for light, for resources from the soil, for water, and so on. Every single animal is in competition with its own species and with other species, for food, for territory, for all of that kind of thing, shelter, safety, etc. And this little guy, this cute little guy here in a cage, I used to work in Glenveigh National Park, and we would trap these characters. This is a mink, and they're from America. And they were brought into Ireland back, I think it was 1910, 1920, somewhere around about there. A rich couple that owned a big estate or having a big birthday party, and it was a birthday party for the wife, and they were trying to think, well, what do you get for the girl who has everything? Because these people are very rich and they had an awful lot of stuff. And they said, I know, I'll bring in some squirrels. So they brought in some squirrels, and the grey squirrels scattered around the place. The mink, these guys were brought in by fur farmers, because they've really, really soft, beautiful soft fur. And back in the day, it was quite a thing to be able to wear a mink fur coat. So it was legal to farm these guys for their fur up until, I think, maybe 2 years ago or so. It's just changed very, very recently. And about 15 years ago, anti-fur farm people released mink. They let a whole lot of mink. They broke into a fur farm, thinking that the mink were having a dreadful time in their little fur farm. But the problem with releasing all of those mink is they turn into an invasive species, because they spread around the place. That ones that are able to survive, they spread around and they outcompete a lot of different things. And they're amazing little creatures. They're able to swim out to our offshore islands, and they eat a lot of birdies out there that would be safe otherwise. And they compete with our otters for salmon and all sorts of different things. So they like water. They're kind of everywhere. So the mink, not the mink's fault. The mink was brought here. It didn't want to be brought here, but it was brought here. And then it escaped for the various different reasons. And then it ends up taking over various things, and it damages the natural balance of stuff. And that's the way, that's what invasives tend to do. And we have to try and remember, It's not the plant's fault. It's not the animal's fault. It's always down to us. It's always our fault. Sorry, particularly people like me. And the young people, we can't blame you guys yet. We'll start blaming you when you're 18. But the adults like me and my just increasing. So invasives can be both plants and they can be animals. And probably the most famous of the invasive plants is the Japanese knotweed. And you can see that in the picture there. And it's from Japan and Asia and that part of the world. It was brought in here back in Victorian times. People planted it in their estates because it grows very vigorously. It's a nice looking kind of thing. But it tends to take over. It outcompetes. And by growing and growing and growing vigorously, and it's got nothing to eat it, no bugs that eat it, no animals really eat it. It tends to take over the place and it pushes out or it outcompetes the native flowers. And if you outcompete all the little celandines or bluebells or daisies or whatever should be there, well, then the bumblebee doesn't have as much food, or the hoverfly doesn't have as much food. And if the hoverfly doesn't have as much food, well, then the robin doesn't have as much food, and so on. So that's some of the consequences of those kind of plants. But they also can be animals. And we often think of animals as big things, but animals can be very small things, like these little oak processionary moths. They have been spreading across Europe, and now they've started coming into Ireland. And they devastate oak trees. They're very, very bad for oak trees. Plus, they're not great for our own health as well with those little hairs that they have. Thankfully, there hasn't been a huge amount of them found yet, but it's something that people are watching out for. An invasive species, they can be plants, they can be animals. They're non-native, but remember, most non-native are just non-native plants or animals. They just sit there and they get on with their business. Whereas the invasives are the ones that grow basically out of control and outcompete the others. And they're a problem in every country in the world. This isn't just an Irish problem. And they're a problem all over the place. Think of the famous Pocahontas problems in Spain. And you're thinking, what on earth is that? In the mid-90s, there was a Disney movie, a cartoon movie called Pocahontas. Some of you might have seen it. Lovely movie. And that is Pocahontas. You can see her in the picture, and she goes off in her adventures with her friend, the raccoon. And the raccoon in the cartoon is very cute and very smart, and the rest of it, as they are in the wild too. So that was leading up to Christmas time. And in Spain, a lot of parents decided it would be a good idea to solve their Christmas list by buying their children baby raccoons. And that's what they did. And in one particular area of Spain, they bought a huge amount. So loads and loads and loads. And the old phrase, a puppy's not just for Christmas, can apply to the raccoon as well. It's not just for Christmas. But these people didn't think much because, of course, the cute little raccoon grew very quickly and didn't fancy really being a pet. And people didn't know what to do with these things and found them really hard to handle. So they just went off to their local forest, their local national park, and dumped them, which is an extremely irresponsible thing to do. If you ever have a raccoon at home and you think of dumping it, don't. Call the likes of us or the National Park Service or someone who can give you advice. So now they have a problem with raccoons invading in one particular national park, and because of the amount of them that were dumped there, and they outcompete some of the other animals that are there. So it's funny the different issues that countries can have. We have raccoons in Ireland, very, very small numbers down south of Ireland, Tipperary, Kilkenny. There have been raccoons brought in and then dumped in forests by Irish people as well. Mad thing to do. But that's what people do. Another little example that I think is kind of good that I encountered. I used to live in New Zealand a very long time ago. I was lucky to live down there. Such a great place, right at the other side of the world. And ling heather, and ling heather is such a common heather and turns all of our hills that kind of beautiful purpley color. And it's really, really common. It supports a huge amount of bees and other insects. Supports rarer birds like red grouse. It provides cover for super rare birds like ring ouzel. It's a really important plant for us to have in Ireland as part of our biodiversity. However, in New Zealand, they don't like it at all because it's not from New Zealand. Some people brought it in, not me, but some people brought it in accidentally, and it spreads and spreads. 1 square meter of ling heather can produce 1 million seeds. So it can spread really quickly, and they don't have the kind of bugs and the kind of animals, bigger animals that would eat it and would control it. So it outcompetes the other ground cover, and they have the same problem, just like we'd have the Japanese knotweed that I described there. So The invasive species are problems in countries all over the world, but back to our Irish ones. So we've got our plants and we've got our animals. There's way too many to go into them all, but I've just put up a couple of pictures of some of the common ones that we know about. So the Japanese knotweed, and people will hear about, and if you ask at home, have you ever heard about Japanese knotweed? Most people have, because it's so invasive. If it's on your property, you cannot sell your house or your field or your land until you deal with the Japanese knotweed. So that has big financial implications for people, big money implications. If you can't sell something that you want to sell, that's a big issue. So it gets more attention than some of the other ones. But a lot of the other ones are just as damaging. You can see the rhododendron ponticum that I mentioned there again. Now there's 600 species of rhododendron in the world, in the wild. And there's loads more have been crossbred by gardeners because they're very beautiful. Glenveigh National Park, which is quite close to where I live in Donegal, has about 250 species of rhododendron. None of them are an issue apart from ponticum. So the name ponticum is the bad bit of it. Rhododendrons is just a group of plants. Ponticum is the one that tends to invade. And it comes from the Mediterranean. It was brought in here. It likes acidy soils, so it grows in our peaty soils in the west coast of Ireland in particular. It is some of the smallest seeds in the world, so it spreads by the wind, and it spreads huge distance. And can take over, as you can see by that picture. It's very pretty. People like to have it. But if you have it in your garden or if you have it in your school grounds or any of those places, you need to remove it. You need to get rid of it because it outcompetes everything
I
else.
already put on it.
It outcompetes everything else, and it takes over the place. And then our native plants and the native animals don't have a chance. The one down at the very bottom here, that beautiful looking white thing, is called giant hogweed. We have other types of hogweed that are native to Ireland. They support a lot of bugs. Bugs love them. But the giant hogweed, again, can take over a place, and the sap on it can be damaging to our own skin. So that actually can produce a bit of a hazard for people. Now, the giant hogweed is huge. It'd be taller than myself. So we have 66 different invasive plants that we have, and we have a whole heap of different animals as well. And the New Zealand flatworm there is one of the examples. Martha is going to explain a little bit later on why that's a bad worm. And of course, the worm is just being a worm, but we've brought it in. We have about 19 different species of ladybird in Ireland. And we often just think the ladybird with the 7 spots, that's by far the most common one. But we've loads of different types of ladybirds. And ladybirds are really cool because ladybirds hunt and kill things like green flies, bugs that eat our farmers' crops, bugs that eat our lovely flowers in our garden, bugs that eat the leaves on the trees that help give us clean air. So they're really important as pest control, as bug control. Ladybirds, they're used sometimes by organic farmers instead of using sprays. They'll bring in ladybirds to eat up the bugs. However, we've managed to bring in a type of ladybird called the harlequin ladybird, and you can see it has very different kind of patterns and colors. It can look quite different, and it hunts our native ladybirds. So there's a ladybird hunting a ladybird, and that's bad because every ladybird that's killed means we don't have as much natural pest control. And then that cute little character down below is called the great white-tooted shrew. And the great white-tooted shrew, we have our own little pygmy shrew, our smallest mammal in Ireland, tiny, tiny thing, even smaller than our little bats. But the great white-tooted shrew tends to kill them off and push them out, outcompete them wherever they are. And that upsets the balance of things as well. So very briefly, I'm going to wrap up now in a second, but what your school can do, one of the first things to do is look up invasives.ie. And for any teachers out there, take if you can or you're interested in going further with this, take a note of that, invasive.ie, as simple as that. Or the other thing is to look up biodiversityireland.ie. They're the two websites. Really, it's all been run by the Biodiversity Data Centre. And that's the group that was set up by the government years ago that monitors all the different living things in nature in Ireland. And so you can find maps of everything from primroses to raccoons and from red deer to New Zealand flatworms, from native to non-native, the whole lot. But they have special pages dedicated to the invasives that are causing the biggest issues. So you can see the top 10 that they've listed out that they see as issues here. But they'll explain them all, they'll map them all, they'll give you some information, and they'll be able to tell you what to be able to do. So what you can do is inform yourself, educate yourself. It's the first step for any of this stuff. And then you can start spreading the word through your Green Schools program and the rest of it. Another thing you can do is if you ever identify Himalayan balsam, Himalayan balsam is a really easy one to control. And that blurry photo there of a boot is my own daughter actually doing some balsam bashing in a project we did locally here. We were studying the river, but we came across this Himalayan balsam. And the children pulled it out because it comes out very, very easily. It's very shallow roots, and you snap it in two and you hang it over a fence or something, and that definitely kills it off. Because Himalayan balsam, it outcompetes and it compromises the nature that's there. It's not so good for the nature that's there. So balsam bashing, if you can identify or find any balsam bashing, or ask your local ranger if you can, where there might be some balsam, Himalayan balsam, or quite often a lot of tidy town groups will know about it as well. And then get your school out there and get smashing it. It's a great fun thing to do. And another thing that you can do is whenever you move to a different place, if you are going into a river, be conscious of what you carry on your shoes. Our shoes can carry up to 30 different species for up to 10 kilometers. And they've done lots of studies on this. So you just think of all the tiny little seeds that can attach into the bottom of your boots and shoes. So this was on that same river project. Every time we went into the river, before we went into a different spot in the river, we stepped into a big pot of disinfectant to make sure that we were killing off any potential invasives that our shoes might carry. And when I got to New Zealand that time, years and years ago, and I didn't know as much about all of this, and they asked for my boots, my hiking boots, and they took them at the security section and they washed them for me. And I remember thinking, what a great country this is. They wash your shoes as you arrive. And they said, no, your shoes were filthy. They could have had invasive species. So we're a little bit behind in Ireland. We're starting to learn and think about it a bit more. Countries like New Zealand, they're very conscious and they literally wash the boots and shoes of every single person coming in if they're not already clean, to make sure to try and stop those seeds or anything else being carried along the way. Last slide on all of this. Invasives.ie, wonderful, wonderful website, give you tons of information. Guys, thanks a mil for listening. Any questions about any of this stuff, pop them into the chat or get in touch with us afterwards.
Brilliant. And thanks for that. Angus, while Leanne gets set up and starts to share her slides, I'll just say that we have actions with every day this week, and our action for today is to go out into do a nature walk and see if you can spot any of the invasive species that we mentioned. So we're right up there. And just to say as well, we are getting better. You were saying that, Angus, that we're getting better. The Biodiversity Centre has actually increase the amount of people working on invasive species this year. So you'll see in your social medias they're taking on a lot of new staff in that area. So maybe it's something that Marta could look in a few years. So Leanne, I'll hand it over to you and we'll go on to our next speaker.
How are you going? Thank you very much for having me on, Robert. Looking forward to chatting you all. I am Liane Costello from Clean Coast. I am the Biodiversity Officer with them, and today I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction into the Clean Coast program just to start, and then we'll chat about a couple of marine invasive species as well. So first of all, who is us? Who are we? What do we do? Clean Coast. So we are a volunteer organisation. We have 2,000 volunteers all around the coast of Ireland. I think we have about 40,000 individuals registered for cleanups. Each group runs, maybe a monthly cleanup every year, a couple of events throughout the year also, and trying to remove as much litter from Ireland's coastline as possible. Other things that we do alongside our cleanups to try and promote biodiversity is, yes, we have the cleanups, that's our basics. We also look at dune restoration as well. And so this will be maybe planting marram grass to help stabilize dune systems. Also access management, so communities might get their local authorities to help them and manage access into dunes to help protect them. Look at biodiversity monitoring. So Aengus already mentioned the National Biodiversity Data Centre. We would work quite closely with them with the Explore Your Shore programme, and trying to promote citizen science, so get people involved with doing that. We've community action funds that people can take advantage of. So we have a grant system that about €500 can go to groups that if they've got ideas for helping. Well, if it's to do with picking up litter, that's great, but also a lot of it will be to do with nature projects, biodiversity projects within their local areas. And then the last one we do a little bit of, and we're hoping to start focusing a bit more on it, is invasive species removal. Now, all this stuff here I'm talking about is on the coast. So unfortunately, our insurance doesn't cover us really to head out that much into the water. We have a couple of groups that are sub-aqua groups, so that would be scuba diving or kayaking or surfing groups that would try and do projects on the water as well. But yeah, most of our groups are working within that coastal system, so not necessarily marine. The thing I'm going to talk about today is the marine side of it. So, oh, there's your answer already. Invasive species drive biodiversity loss. We're going to do a little question here, guys. So if everyone, I'll give you about 10 seconds. I've given you a hint if you saw that one. If you could just put into the chat box whether you think this is true or false. So invasive species drive biodiversity loss. So if you were listening to Aengus previously, you'd have a good idea of what that was. Let's see what we'll get some answers coming in. We've got true, perfect, yes. Yes, all right. Very good. That's it. We're all listening. Perfect. Aengus, well done. Excellent presentation. We've all got the point. Yeah, so absolutely. So just pop on there. True. They are one of the top 5 drivers of biodiversity loss globally. So very important and maybe something we don't think about so much. And I think quite often, you know, a lot of non-native species or alien species are have been naturalized in different countries. We might even notice that they're invasives. We might be walking past them every single day, and we don't realize that they are causing a threat to our native system. The next question. So over 100 alien species are in Irish waters. So this is the most recent record. So a 2019 study looking at it. Did they find over 100 alien species in Irish waters? Okay, we got a false, we got a true. Nice, very good. Any more coming in? That's it. Yeah, so again, I think this is one of the things with non-native species or alien species. There's a lot more of them than we probably realize, and it's something that we're starting to learn a lot more about, and probably put a lot more focus into it. But yeah, we have true, so 122 marine and brackish species reported in Irish waters. Now that's a huge number. 20 of these only 20 of these have been seen as highly invasive. These are also primarily, I think the majority of them are mollusks and invertebrates and also algae species. So the plants of the sea that we're looking at. So it's not so much fish. We do have 122. 20 are quite highly invasive, seen as highly invasive. And that 122 is just a single record of an alien species that they found in Irish waters. And the environment has to be correct for these species to be able to really to take hold. So I wouldn't be absolutely worried that that's such a large number. And there has to be other factors that will allow it to become a fully invasive species. So this is, yeah, just species that aren't supposed to be here, but aren't necessarily invasive just at this time. And then alien species are easy to control in the marine environment. So Aengus was chatting about the balsam bashing, and there is some, I suppose, within the terrestrial. So when you're on land, it's a bit, there's kind of ways that we can remove it, but do you see it as being as easy in the marine space? It's got a couple of falses coming in. Yeah. Nice. Okay, cool. So yeah, like obviously our seas are big. Our seas don't have borders. Our seas don't have ends. It's continuously moving. There's currents that move everything everywhere. We live in a highly global system where we have a lot of transport across our seas. It's extremely hard to stop the movement of alien species in the water. It's very hard to remove invasive species once they take hold in the marine environment, because things do transport quite easily within the water column. So unfortunately, it is it's really important that we, I suppose at a high level, that we have regulations in place, that we have legislation in place. As Aengus was saying with New Zealand, we need strong controls to make sure that these species don't take hold here, because once they're here, it is very, very hard to remove them. So well done, guys. That was like, I'd say like 100%. Everyone did very well there. Thank you very much to everyone. We're going to move on to a bit more of me chatting. So just, I suppose it's slightly different from the land. There is obviously a lot of land-based species can be moved through shipping. I suppose historically, animals like cats and rats would have done big damage on small islands as we colonize different areas around the world. But in the marine environment, and then I suppose more recently, I suppose in the in our, or a lot of the species we talk about on land can be maybe horticulture coming in from gardens. And from a marine point of view, there's just, yeah, as we said, there's a lot of pathways that it can take. The two main ones that are the issue is our shipping and aquaculture. So the shipping is quite interesting. I suppose you could have species connect to hulls of boats, and then they'll travel. You know, you could have it from the Northwest Pacific going all the way over to us in the Atlantic, and we could bring species all that way, and they can do very well. Generally, the characteristics of an invasive species is that it's very good at surviving, so it can survive for very long times. But also, you may not be aware with shipping as well, ships, to help them balance in the water, will actually suck up a load of water in the harbor that they're in. And so it's called ballast water. So they'll suck up a huge amount of it. They'll use it to help them stabilize, to help them navigate through stormy seas. And then once they get to their location, they then release that ballast water. So obviously it could suck in a huge amount of species. So species living in the water in a planktonic larvae phase, suck it in, and then when it goes to a non-native area, it could end up releasing it and it could end up doing well. Aquaculture, again, is that we're bringing in species that would maybe not necessarily be native to an area. We bring it in, we start growing it because it's got benefits, either fast growing, it deals well with hard conditions, it does really well within the aquaculture area, but then it breaks free and it ends up outcompeting native species. So just one example that we have is Japanese wireweed, which you can look at for both these, and both shipping and also aquaculture. First recorded in Europe in 1973. It can be associated with oyster farming. So again, these oysters, they're the Pacific oysters. We're coming from the Northwest Pacific. The Japanese wireweed is coming from the same location. So as spat was brought in to grow in these farms, it is hypothesized that obviously the seaweed was also coming in with it. It then was probably first recorded on the Isle of Wight, but they saw that probably it came from North France, and then through both shipping and movement between countries and tides, or not tides, sorry, currents as well, the plants moved all around Europe. In Ireland, it became was first recorded in the mid-90s, and now it can be found quite prolific all around the coast. In its native range, it only grows about 2 meters. In its non-native range, it can grow up to about 16 meters in length. It's extremely fast growing. It grows 10 centimeters every day, and it outcompetes our native species as well. It will change habitats for the negative at times, but it can also be a positive, that it can also create a habitat for species where there may not be that much seaweed. So again, it is brought, so it was brought in first probably through aquaculture, but then through movement of people, tides, everything, it then spreads across the whole continent. Coming from a clean coast point of view, we talk a lot about plastic and litter, and there is obviously new emerging transport location for a lot of species as well, and this is plastic in our ocean. So plastic sticks around for a very long time, it floats really well, and it can be taken by currents everywhere. So you can find that some species will grab hold of them, and they can travel from continent to continent. It's just another way that invasive species can pop up over seas and oceans and very easily then cause issues within a non-native region. So they are called epibionts. Now they've existed for everywhere. So these are goose barnacles. They're a pelagic species, so they live in the sea. They grab hold of pieces of wood, whatever they can to raft onto. And you can see them here. They're in a piece of plastic that's washed up in Clare, on the west coast of Ireland. Now, this isn't an invasive species. This is fine, but just to give an example of what could happen if this was a non-native species coming in. I'm going to go very quickly through this because I was going to finish up soon enough on this, but just you may not be aware, But a lot of species in the sea will have, even though, so you've got oysters here, and they're quite I suppose, large species. Once they've reproduced, they've settled, they become adults, they settle on hard substrates or on hard rocks and stuff. But they have a pelagic phase. So basically, the unfertilized egg sperm will be released, it becomes fertilized, it then travels in the water. So that's how it spreads. Okay, so they release the eggs into the water column, get fertilized, and then the water column takes it to another area where it will then reproduce and then go to adulthood. We have the Pacific oyster here. So this was again another species that was brought in for farming. I actually mentioned it a moment ago. It's really fast growing, really great for aquaculture, and deals with very hard conditions as well. Much better growing than, unfortunately, our native species. It got escaped from farming, the aquaculture farming, and it now outcompetes our native species. So again, it's going to release thousands of eggs into the water column. The water column will then take it. They found the Pacific oyster can be in a larvae phase for about 3 to 4 weeks. And it can travel up to 1,000 kilometers in this time as well. So it can really spread very, very far. Just for example, that's the European flat oyster, our example, or our native oyster, in comparison with the farmed Pacific oyster that's coming from the Northwest Pacific. So quickly, actions against invasives, just run through these. So strict regulations, as we spoke about New Zealand, and that ballast water management. So there is ways of treating the ballast water to make sure that there isn't invasive species coming from different areas around the globe. Certain aquaculture procedures as well. So that's obviously a higher level control and eradication where possible. But again, it's very difficult within that marine zone. So if we can avoid getting them in to the system, first of all, happy days. And where you guys can jump in, Aengus spoke about it a bit, so I won't go on too much, but citizen science, so monitoring species, so learning how to identify these species, and then going to something like the National Biodiversity Data Centre and using citizen science apps to monitor these and to give information just gives the researchers a huge amount of help when it comes to mitigation and planning and control of our invasive species in our waters. And then if we are looking at that plastic rafting, if we can remove as much of it as possible, and I'm always going to big up, because I'm Clean Coast, I'm always going to big up an old beach clean, but popping out and trying to remove litter from the beach is an amazing way to avoid that. That's small, I suppose it's not the biggest problem, but one of the ways that things are moving across our oceans. We've seen this before. Good to the National Biodiversity Data Centre, the great work that they do. And again, yes, the invasives.ie or invasives team is growing, so this should become a much more spoken about and important place. And then hopefully you guys can help out with some of the monitoring of it as well. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Liane. That's fantastic. Yeah, and we talked a little bit about citizen science there. That's great to hear. And we talked a bit about it earlier on in the week. So if anyone doesn't really know what that is, it's people like you and me, every one of us can go and learn about those different species and tell people so we know where they are. Better not we know where they are, then we can actually tackle those invasive species and we can promote our native species. So someone who's done a little bit of that is our next speaker, Martha, who when she was out in the school garden found an invasive species and then she decided to learn more about it because she didn't have the information about it. So it's great to have Martha, who's a secondary school student, not too much older than some of the students watching here today. And she wrote a fantastic article and published it with our Young Reporters for the Environment program, which is another program that even our primary schools can get involved with. So keep an eye out for that. Come September, we'll be launching it again. And you can definitely get involved. I'll leave it there, and Martha, you can unmute and start sharing your slides and tell us all about the New Zealand flatworm.
Perfect. Hi everyone. I'm Martha, as was previously said. I'm a third year in secondary school, and here's my project. Hold on, I'll start it from the start. Okay. So my project title is Waging War on the Killer Kiwi, Project Triangulatus. I'm just going to briefly go over what an invasive species is because I know it's been talked about already. An invasive species is a species from a different region that has made its way to a new environment where it does not fit. They can affect our economy because a lot of invasive species can bring along harmful attributes which can negatively affect things like agriculture, which can end up costing a lot in damages. And they can also affect our health because once again, those negative attributes can harm us. For example, what I'm about to talk about, the New Zealand flatworm, it is coated in a mucus that can really irritate your skin. So if you ever find one, make sure you're wearing gloves. Um, if you're going to touch it or anything. And then they can also affect our wildlife because they can, once again, they can compete with other native wildlife, and a lot of the time they take up a lot more resources than our native wildlife. Here's just some background on the New Zealand flatworm. It first arrived in Ireland in the 1960s. There's no official first record of it, but it is largely assumed that it made its way over here through um, imported plants. For example, eggs could have been on those imported plants, and once they arrived here, they hatched. So you can see that on this graph here from the National Biodiversity Data Centre, um, you can see this big red spot up by Belfast is where they're quite dense. There's quite a dense population of them, and they've gradually spread throughout the Republic, but there's far less recordings down in the Republic. And just some more background on them, just like their appearance and everything. They're black, brown, and can even be quite like dark purple in color. The picture on the left is a New Zealand flatworm I found myself. They can reach up to 20 centimeters in length. They can be found year round because they survive up to 0 degrees. So the winter doesn't really affect them too much, but there is more of them out now since it's warmer. And they're hermaphroditic, which means they can reproduce by themselves. So they don't need two of them to lay eggs. And usually they'll lay about 6 eggs per worm. So there's a lot of them out at the minute. And why are they a problem? They're a problem because they prey on our native earthworms, which can lead to soil degradation, which just means the soil quality has gotten very poor. And without the earthworms there, because they've eaten them, it makes the soil very infertile, and crops can't grow as well then, which can lead to agricultural loss and eventually economic loss. They cost the North approximately 34 million in damages per year, which is a lot of money. And since there's not as much information about them here in the Republic, there's no official record of how much it costs us, but we can only really imagine it would be around that number if we had a better response to them. They're an increasing threat to areas depending on agriculture and crop farming because once again they cause soil degradation, which makes it harder for crops to grow. And unlike our native earthworms, they don't aerate the soil, so they offer no positives to our ecosystem or environment. And this picture here is just how the New Zealand flatworm digests the native earthworm because they use that mucus that I mentioned to digest the earthworm. My research. I chose to research the New Zealand flatworm because I discovered one on my school grounds in May of 2023, and it was the first time I'd ever heard of it. So I was very curious, and once I began to learn about it, I was honestly quite concerned because I live and go to school in an agricultural area. Um, it's very dependent on crop farming and market gardening. And I was wondering, why is there such little awareness and information about this, especially in towns or areas that are very dependent on agriculture? So I wanted to research it further to see if I could help to raise awareness about it. So yeah, I was really concerned for agricultural areas, and I wanted to research how the long-term effects could affect our economy or agriculture or wildlife. So my method included setting traps around my area. So that included my school, parks, the local allotments, and farmland. To set traps around the local farms, I spoke to students in my school who lived or worked on farmland, and I asked them if they would set these traps on their farm for me, which a lot of them did, and I just asked them to check it out like weekly and see if they could find anything. And a community member of the local allotments actually reached out to me and told me that she had found New Zealand flatworms there in the past, and she gave me permission to set traps in her allotment, which was very helpful. So I sent out an online survey as well, which was just really, oh, sorry, which was really to gain more insight into how much the public knew about the species and how concerned they were about it. I had to collect all the worms that I found, and under the Irish Wildlife Act, I had to euthanize them, so I just had to put them down. And the most humane way to do that was to put them in the freezer. Um, Traps were set using sheets of black plastic secured to the ground with rocks. This attracted the flatworm as they like to be sheltered, and black sheets of plastic kind of retain some heat, so they like to be sheltered and warm in there. And these are just my survey results. So in total, I got 427 results, but I then narrowed that down to 260. The 260 is just from my area, which is what I was focusing on. Out of these 260 people, 88 worked in agricultural backgrounds, which is this result here. I asked them to about their knowledge of the New Zealand flatworm, and once again, this just focuses on people who work in agriculture, and we have a 48% split. So 48% of people said they would have an awareness of the New Zealand flatworm, and 48% said they would not. And really, we would like to see the number of people saying yes to be far higher, because people in agriculture should be made far more aware of this issue as it can affect them directly. And as it's becoming more of a threat over the years, they really need to know about this issue before it gets any worse. And then just to compare, we have another graph of knowledge of the New Zealand flatworm by the general public, with 66% of people saying they wouldn't really know anything about it, which once again, we would like to see far more people being aware of the issue. And this is still just like a lack of awareness and, a lack of information being spread about it. We also have is enough attention brought to this invasive species, and despite the previous two being a large amount of people saying they don't know about it, 88% of people still said that they don't think enough attention is brought to this invasive species, which is quite evident between these two graphs. And finally, we had a question of, is the New Zealand flatworm a threat to Ireland's natural environment? With 58% of people saying unsure. And we'd like to see a lot more people in this green section of saying yes. We'd like to see a lot more people saying they do think it's a threat. Because it is a great threat, and it's a threat to agriculture and often community and our economy. So we want to see a lot more awareness raised so people know that this is a threat. And these are just my research results. Through my research, I found a presence of both the New Zealand flatworm and the Australian flatworm. That's another invasive species worm. And these pictures here compare the two worms. The darker one is the New Zealand flatworm, and the lighter one is the Australian flatworm. And then the picture below is an Australian flatworm I found in the allotments. I found 2 New Zealand flatworms in the allotments, along with 3 Australian flatworms, which is a big worry because, allotments are a place for people to go as a community to grow plants and crops. And we kind of have to think about, if this issue goes under the radar for much longer, it could affect these communities and it could really have a negative impact. All of the worms that I recorded were the first recordings in the area, and it proves just how little people know about it, because if I found those ones that quickly, and it was in the middle of January, so there was not as much as there would be now. And I found that number of worms, and they were the first recordings. It means they're present here, and there should be a lot more recordings. So as a result of this, I think they're going underreported here in the Republic, because there's very little information known about them by the public, and there definitely should be more awareness raised. So finally, my conclusion is that, once again, from my research, I gathered that the New Zealand flatworm is going underreported in the Republic of Ireland. And to combat this, I'd like to see an awareness campaign to inform farmers and people who import plants about this issue before it gets any worse. And just if you'd like to learn anything more, I've linked my article there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well done. That was great. And I've also put a link to your article into the chat. So well done. It's not an easy thing for a student to come forward and talk like this in front of everyone. So thank you for that, and thank you for taking time out because I know you're preparing for your junior cert. So nice distraction, I hope. So if we have any questions, you can pop them in the chat. We have all our panel here, so they can all I'll pin them all, and then if we have any questions, you can ask our panel. We had a few questions come in already. So, and Aengus, I seen you answer one about the seaweed. So,
I did indeed. Yeah, seaweed's cool, isn't it? Because seaweeds were some of the first plants that ever grew. So there was loads of seaweeds in the sea before there was anything on land, before there was mosses on land and lichens, and they were the first plants to start taking over our land. Habitats over dry land, basically, hundreds of millions of years ago. But before that, there was seaweed, and they helped literally change the atmosphere by capturing carbon, keeping the carbon, storing the carbon, and releasing oxygen to making the air pure enough for us to be able to evolve and now thrive. And they still do that role. Seaweed's really important.
yeah, and we just got one there about so are there non-native species of plants and animals that don't become invasive?
Yeah, well, that'll be
Other
most of
than-
them. Most of them. So you think about so much stuff that's growing in your garden. If you've got roses in your garden, they don't become invasive. Our dogs and cats, well, cats can, I suppose, actually, but they shouldn't if we manage them. Like I said earlier on, the horse chestnut tree, or the sycamore tree, or the Sitka spruce tree, trees that quite often, I bet an awful lot of the students here would be able to recognize those three trees a lot quicker than they could a lot of our native trees. But they've only been in the country for the last 400 years. They were brought in around about the plantation time. Before then, they did not exist. So the Irish people, whomever we were for the last 9,000 years or so, wouldn't have recognized those trees up until recently. And those trees, they don't really do any harm. They don't spread. They don't take over. They're non-native. So an awful lot of non-native things don't become invasive, but some unfortunately do.
On that line, and I know there's lots of questions coming in here for you, but so there's a question on invasive tree species. Do we have any invasive tree species? I know we have an awful lot of introduced tree species, but do we have any that are considered invasive?
Well, yes. So some tree species can invade in the wrong place, is the way to put it. So if you look at Sitka spruce plantations, and if they've been planted on bog and peaty bog, back in the olden days, we used to think that was grand. Now we realize that's a disaster because, of course, peat, as you probably all know, peat captures twice the amount of carbon. Peat captures and holds the world's peat twice the amount of carbon as all the forests put together. So peat is so important when it comes to climate change. And we're one of the last countries in the world that drains the peat, which destroys the biodiversity and causes flooding later on, and then rips it out of the ground and sets it on fire as turf. We're mad. And this stuff captures so much carbon, and by draining it and setting it on fire, it's really bad for the atmosphere and all the rest of it. So anyway, that practice is dying out more and more and more. We don't do it on a big scale anymore in the big industrial ways. But where some of those forests were planted, the Sitka spruce will sometimes lodgepole pine is another one, can start taking over the peaty land, and they'll start to dry it out and change the habitat. So sometimes, yeah, some trees can become invasive. In general, most of them aren't, though. I can't think of another example off the top of my head.
Yeah, I couldn't either, and I work quite a lot with trees. I work with Leaf Ireland, so I couldn't think of one off the top of my head. But as you said, it's where they're being planted that can cause the issue. For example, our sycamore that most of you will recognize that has the little helicopter seed, yeah, is actually quite toxic to horses. So if it's planted beside horses, it can cause serious damage to horses. If they eat it, they can get a muscular issue. It doesn't happen to all horses, but it's something that we need to keep an eye on as well. There was a few questions, Liane, about plastics in the oceans, and kind of how they're affecting the fish, how many fish are dying from them, and I suppose you could say what can we do to reduce the plastics as well?
Yeah, so I suppose the first one about I suppose fish dying. There's a couple of different ways all of our species interact with litter in the oceans. And I suppose um it's maybe not as straightforward as alive or dead. I suppose there will be interactions where they could be eating it and it could cause issues with, I suppose, swimming, with their own so cetacean. So like with their full bellies, they might feel like they're quite full, and then they're not getting in enough food, and it causes limitations for them in kind of succeeding in survival. Um, you could also have that they might have an interaction where they might get caught in it as well, entangled in some form of plastic as well. A specific number on fish, I wouldn't have it exactly, but there's definitely, I think the most recent review is looking at about marine species. So that's everything from your fish to your invertebrates, your mammals, your birds. It's about 800 marine species that have definitively been recorded plastics within their system. So it's a huge thing, and it is affecting lots of species, and it's something that we do need to have care for. There is obviously we've inherited this, so I suppose the mass production of plastics has been going since kind of 1940s onwards. We were talking, Aengus was saying, we can't blame the kiddos. I suppose, there is a certain amount of inheritance of this world that we have. I think putting the blame on anybody is a difficult thing to do. It's what we do now, it's the steps forwards, and it's us as adults creating systems now that help things going forward. So obviously to help stop interactions with any marine species, it is to either stop the litter going there or to remove it from there. A handy way to do that, obviously, if we're stopping doing it, is reducing single-use plastics. So yeah, we are choosing to use your old like reusable bottles, reusable cups, whatever. There you go. Yeah, exactly. And like, and again, there's all of us. Yeah, there is. Plastics are so beneficial as well. Like the whole creation of plastics has led to huge advancements in technology, healthcare. A lot of people are alive because we can maybe use something to apply some medicine or take blood or whatever, because we can take that and then we can throw it out immediately. So we don't have
Yes,
all
so we're not trying to
contamination
get rid of plastics altogether. We're
completely.
just trying to get rid of those ones that we end up throwing
Yeah,
away.
exactly.
I put in the chat a thing that we did with you guys, the Green Schools Plastic Free document. So that was Clean Coast and Green Schools together, and all the different tips that you can do around the school.
Yeah.
Um, we're coming to the end, but I wanted to ask before we finish up, Marta, you were talking about the when you found these worms that you had to get rid of them, you had to put them down. Um, you said euthanasia, which is a much nicer word, but I didn't know if anyone would know that, so I encouraged you to explain that a little bit more. But if schools come across it, they should, what should they do? They should contact the biodiversity, let them know it's
Yeah.
there,
Yeah, you
data
can
center.
contact the National Biodiversity Data Center. Throughout my project, I worked quite closely with Dr. Una Fitzpatrick from the National Biodiversity Data Center, and she recommends that if you're not able to, go to the greatest measure and, euthanize them or put them down, the best thing you can do is just record them and make people aware that they are there.
Yeah, brilliant. Because I was in doing renewal visits. We do the renewal visits before you get the flag for green schools, and I was in a school, and the students were still traumatized from a teacher dispatching one of these firms in front of them. So maybe we don't just hit them with a shovel, and we collect them up and we put them in the freezer instead, and that might be a much nicer way to take this species that is doing some damage and get it out of our environment where we can. So, on that kind of happier note, what I'm going to suggest is if you can at all this week or next week, is to get out for a walk, try and identify the species that are growing around you. And if you find some invasive species, to get in touch with the Biodiversity Data Center and register them there. And we'll leave it there. And a huge thank you to our speakers today and all of our schools who came and joined us. So, thank you. I'm going to hit the stop on the recording.